Welcome. You're here now, and there's nothing else you need to do. Let your shoulders soften. Let the thoughts slow down. You've carried enough for one day, and this time is yours. We're about to drift through the quiet past, a calm, slow journey through history, told gently so you can rest deeply. You don't need to remember the facts. You don't need to stay awake. Just let the words move like waves and settle into stillness as we begin. In the hush before the city stirred, when only the faintest orange brushed the sky above Rome's 7 hills, there was a stillness that belonged to no one. The air was cool, the ground damp with the memory of night, and in one modest home in the Subura district, where patrician blood lived beside poverty, a child was born beneath a name that would one day swell with meaning. He was not yet a conqueror, not yet an orator or general, just a newborn wrapped in linen, blinking into torchlight. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Born in 100 BCE, his arrival coincided with the Republic's slow unraveling, a time of marble dignity and hidden daggers, when tradition still held sway, but ambition boiled just beneath the surface. Caesar's family, the Julii, claimed descent from Julius, the son of Aeneas, and by that lineage, from Venus herself. But though the name carried the echo of myth, the family no longer held fortune. The Julii were noble, yes, but threadbare. Their wealth had faded, their power minimal. Caesar's early life was shaped by the alleys of the Subura, a crowded, noisy, often dangerous district near the heart of Rome. Here, senators and slaves crossed paths, taverns pressed against shrines, laundry fluttered above open sewers. The smell of fish, sweat, and incense clung to the walls. Life was immediate and raw, and for young Caesar, it was education before school ever began. His mother, Aurelia, was a woman of steel wrapped in calm. She ran the household with precision, overseeing not just meals and servants, but the moral direction of her son. It was she who woke before the dawn, she who lit the household altar, she who reminded him, quietly, daily, of who he was, and what Rome expected of him. His father, Gaius Julius Caesar the Elder, held modest positions, praetor, then governor in Asia. He was respected, but not revered. He died when Caesar was 16, leaving the boy head of the household far earlier than tradition allowed. The mantle did not crush him, it focused him. Caesar's mornings began with ritual. The lares, household gods, were honored at the small family shrine in the atrium. A pinch of incense, a whispered prayer. The past was never gone in Rome. It was layered into every act. Every gesture bore witness. This was how the young learned to carry legacy, not through speech, but repetition. The home itself was modest for a patrician lineage. Its walls were shaded in ochre and cracked with age. Mosaics lined the floors, though some were chipped. The impluvium, a shallow pool that caught rain from the open roof, glistened in the early light. This was not luxury, it was continuity, the illusion of stability maintained by ritual and pride. Outside, the city breathed. Vendors called out from carts loaded with olives, lentils, and wine. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer marked the passage of time better than any sundial. Distant temple bells chimed softly, as Vestal virgins crossed marble courtyards in silence. Rome moved not with haste, but with purpose. Every street, every column, every citizen part of a larger rhythm. Even as a child, Caesar watched. He listened. Where others learned facts, he studied behavior. He saw how men bowed lower to some than others, how silence could dominate a space more than shouting, how power moved, not just officially, but invisibly. He was not a loud boy, not brash, but there was gravity in him, even then, a patience, a precision, as though he was storing every moment for later use. And all around him, Rome tilted slowly toward change. Education in Caesar's household began early, and it began at home. Tutors, often Greek, were employed to teach him reading, writing, and the earliest threads of philosophy. The boy's mornings were divided between lessons and observation. He copied passages from Homer and Ennius onto wax tablets with a stylus, his hand aching by the second hour. These were not idle tasks. They were exercises in endurance, mental, emotional, and physical. But even more than myth or poetry, it was rhetoric that held power in Rome. The ability to persuade, to move the hearts of men with only a voice. This was the mark of greatness. Aurelia ensured that Caesar not only studied speech, but watched it in practice. She took him to the forum, to the steps of the Senate, to public trials where orators duelled with words sharpened like blades. He watched as reputations were made and unmade in front of jeering crowds. He saw how applause could be timed, how silence could be orchestrated. Words, he learned, were not merely spoken, they were wielded. He also studied law, not just in scrolls, but in the streets. He learned which officials could be bribed, which ones stood for principle, which pretended to. He watched how men invoked tradition to protect themselves, and innovation to destroy rivals. Rome was a city of order, but its laws flexed like reeds in the wind. Power dictated interpretation. As Caesar grew, the contradictions of the Republic became more visible. Patricians spoke of duty, then schemed behind closed doors. Plebeians demanded justice, but were placated with grain and games. Senators debated ethics in marble halls while arranging assassinations in shadowed villas. He learned early that Rome was not what it claimed to be. And yet, this did not sour him. It focused him. He saw that within the chaos, there was opportunity, and within that opportunity, a narrow path towards something larger than survival, legacy. He also grew tall, his features sharpened. He had the lean body of a runner, the posture of someone who had been taught to stand still when others fidgeted. His eyes did not dart, they absorbed. In the evenings, after his lessons, he would walk the edges of the Tiber. The river was both artery and mirror. Barges drifted slowly by, carrying stone, spices, and sometimes slaves. He watched their silhouettes fade into the dusk. Across the water, temples glowed golden with lamplight, and the murmur of prayers echoed across the surface. This was his Rome, not the city of legends, but the living thing, fragile, hungry, unpredictable. And even then, as a teenager, he did not fear it. He belonged to it. In some unspoken way, it already belonged to him. When Caesar was in his mid-teens, Rome began to shift more violently. The Republic, once bound by checks and rituals, was bending under the weight of personal ambition. The Senate still held its debates and made its decrees, but the streets whispered a different truth, one of bribery, backroom agreements, and blood. It was during these years that Gaius Marius, Caesar's uncle by marriage, became one of Rome's central figures. Marius had risen not by noble lineage, but through military brilliance and populist appeal. He reformed the legions, granting landless men the chance to serve, to earn, to matter. For this, the elite hated him. For this, the people loved him. Marius represented power earned outside the traditional paths, and for a young Caesar, he represented possibility. But Marius was not alone. His rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, was his opposite in temperament, but equal in ambition. Sulla was icy, calculating, and aristocratic to the core. Where Marius courted the masses, Sulla maneuvered through elite networks, manipulating Senate votes with chilling precision. Their conflict would shape the Republic and Caesar's fate. As tensions rose between the two men, Rome teetered on the edge of civil war. Political violence became common. Riots flared in the Forum. Grain shipments were intercepted. Assassinations were rumored, then confirmed. The air grew sharp with uncertainty. Caesar, still a teenager, stood quietly amid the chaos. He watched, listened, and took note of how quickly structure gave way when men believed themselves greater than the system meant to contain them. Then, Sulla marched on Rome. It was an act so shocking, so unprecedented, that the old senators could do nothing but gape as legions entered the city not to defend it, but to claim it. Rome was not invaded by an enemy. It was seized by one of its own. Marius fled. His allies were hunted. And in the wake of the violence, Sulla declared himself dictator, not for a term, but indefinitely. He rewrote laws. He issued prescriptions, public lists of enemies to be killed, their property seized, their names erased. One of those names, almost, was Caesar's. He had recently married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, one of Marius's most trusted men. It was a political marriage, but not one Caesar would abandon. Sulla demanded he divorce her. Caesar refused. It was not defiance for defiance's sake. It was a line, a refusal to bend for the sake of safety. And for that, he was stripped of his inheritance, his position, and nearly his life. He went into hiding. For a time he lived in exile, moving between sympathetic estates, changing his appearance, using false names. The Republic was not protecting him. It was hunting him. But he did not cower. He endured. And when Sulla was finally convinced by others to spare the boy, a choice he made reluctantly, muttering that there were many Mariuses in that one, Caesar emerged not broken, but honed. After the storm of Sulla's dictatorship passed, Caesar emerged from hiding into a Rome still trembling from the shock of civil war. Though officially spared, he returned with nothing. No office, no inheritance, no standing. But he returned with something more valuable: clarity. He understood now that Rome was no longer governed by principle alone. It moved according to force, favor, and perception. The Republic was not sacred. It was strategic. He began quietly to rebuild. Caesar joined the priesthood, taking up the mantle of Flamen Dialis, a high-ranking religious role with ceremonial obligations. It was more symbolic than political, but it restored a degree of visibility. He attended sacrifices, presided over rituals, played the role of pious youth, all while watching the city recalibrate itself in Sulla's wake. But his ambition stretched far beyond temple steps. He left Rome for military service in Asia Minor, where he began to earn recognition, not just as a patrician, but as a soldier. In one campaign, he was awarded the Corona Civica, a crown of oak leaves given for saving a fellow Roman's life in battle. It was among the highest honours a citizen could receive, and it marked the first time his name began to circulate beyond his lineage. More than valour, Caesar demonstrated control. He led without overstepping. He advised without arrogance. Commanders noted his discipline, his ability to inspire without theatrics. Among the men, he was respected. Among the officers, he was remembered. After his military service, he travelled to Rhodes to study rhetoric. There, under the famed teacher Apollonius Molon, he refined his voice into something precise, deliberate, and deeply persuasive. The art of speaking in Rome was no less critical than the art of war. A single speech could sway the Senate or ignite the crowd. Caesar treated it with the seriousness of combat. It was during his return voyage from Rhodes that fate intervened again. He was captured by pirates. He spent nearly 40 days in their custody, but he did not grovel. He composed poetry, gave speeches, participated in their games. When they laughed at his threats of revenge, he smiled. Rome noticed. Here was a man who was not yet in office, not yet at the helm of legions, but who commanded reality like one already touched by fate. When he returned to Rome, he walked with a different posture, not as a survivor of the Republic's brutality, but as someone who had begun to see how it might be reshaped. After his pardon, Caesar did not rush back into Roman politics. He understood that power, once lost, must be rebuilt carefully, not reclaimed in haste, but shaped with intention. He left the capital and joined the army. It was in Asia Minor that Caesar first wore armour in service of the Republic. Far from the Senate, far from Sulla's shadow, he began the next chapter of his life, not as a noble or a fugitive, but as a soldier. And there, in the dust of foreign provinces, he earned respect not through title, but through action. In one campaign, during the siege of Mytilene, he was awarded the Corona Civica, a crown of oak leaves given only to those who saved the life of a fellow Roman in battle. It was a rare honour, especially for someone so young. Soldiers noticed, commanders whispered. The boy who had once defied a dictator was now proving himself under fire. But Caesar's strength was not only in his sword arm. It was in his ability to observe the world and bend to it without breaking. He saw how generals won loyalty, not just through victory, but through presence. How discipline mattered, but fairness mattered more. He saw what made men follow, not just with fear, but with devotion. When his service ended, Caesar did not return to Rome immediately. He travelled further east to study rhetoric in Rhodes, an island famed for its orators and philosophers. He sought out Molon, a teacher renowned for his ability to shape not just speech, but the soul beneath it. Under Molon's guidance, Caesar refined his delivery, his cadence, his pauses. He learned how to wield silence as a weapon, how to draw breath before a sentence and make that breath speak volumes. They laughed. He did not. Even in vengeance there was precision. Even in wrath, strategy. By the time he returned to Rome, Caesar had become more than a name. He had become a force. Caesar returned to a Rome that had changed, but not healed. Sulla was gone, but his proscriptions had left scars. Families had been torn apart, estates confiscated. Fear still lingered in the corners of the Senate and the alleys of the Forum. The Republic had survived its seizure, but it had not recovered from the wound. Into this uncertain landscape, Caesar began his political career, not with trumpets, but with careful, measured steps. He aligned himself with the Populares, the political faction that claimed to represent the common people. This was not mere idealism, it was strategy. The Senate was fractured. The aristocracy mistrusted him. But the people, the artisans, the veterans, the farmers, saw in him a reflection of their struggle. He began as a pontifex, a religious office that allowed him access to Rome's spiritual life and public rituals. From there, he became a military tribune, then a quaestor, serving in Hispania. Each role was a rung in the cursus honorum, the traditional ladder of Roman public service. But Caesar climbed it not by following precedent, but by bending it subtly at each step. In Hispania, he witnessed not just politics, but empire. He saw the wealth that flowed into Rome from its provinces, and the resentment that grew in its wake. He saw what happened when local rulers bowed to Roman law, but seethed beneath Roman arrogance. It was a lesson in both expansion and its costs. During his time in the provinces, he visited a statue of Alexander the Great. He stood before it for hours, unmoving. At the time, Caesar was in his early 30s, the same age Alexander had been when he had conquered the known world. Caesar had done much, but he had not conquered. Not yet. That moment marked something in him. Not envy, not shame, but urgency. He returned to Rome with renewed purpose. He sought higher office, first as aedile, then as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. It was a prestigious position, deeply political despite its religious title. Caesar won the election against older, wealthier, more established men, through charm, persuasion, and a carefully deployed web of debts and favors. He understood, more than most, that Rome was not ruled by the Senate or by gods. It was ruled by belief, and those who could shape it. By now his name was known. His debts were vast, his ambitions barely concealed. But the people loved him, and the Senate, though wary, could not deny his rise. He was not just moving forward, he was gathering momentum. By the late 60s BCE, Caesar had become a man who could no longer be ignored. He was elected praetor and later served again in Hispania, this time as a propraetor, a governor of sorts, with greater autonomy and command. There, he won military victories, settled debts with plunder, and further cemented his reputation as both a capable administrator and a skilled general. His soldiers admired him, not because he commanded them with distance, but because he walked beside them, spoke their language, and shared in their discomfort. They saw him in the mud and in the heat. They saw him take the front line when needed, and they remembered. It was in Hispania that Caesar encountered one of the most potent lessons of his life. Power was not given. It was taken, earned, and held by those who understood how fragile belief could be. He returned to Rome not just with trophies, but with the quiet loyalty of men who would follow him again, across rivers, across borders, across history. But Rome, as always, was boiling beneath the surface. The Senate was fractured. The people were restless. Pompey the Great, once Rome's shining military hero, returned from the east with victories and legions. But the Senate balked at ratifying his settlements and rewarding his troops. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, still hungered for more influence, his gold flooding the political streets. Each man powerful, each isolated. Caesar saw the shape of the opportunity. He met with both men privately. He did not flatter. He did not beg. He proposed an alliance. Thus was born the first triumvirate, an informal but unbreakable pact between three of the most powerful men in the Republic. Caesar would run for consul with their backing. Crassus would ensure financial support. Pompey would lend military gravitas. In 59 BCE, Caesar was elected consul. His enemies in the Senate gritted their teeth. His allies prepared for action. And Caesar began his year in office with a calculated storm of reforms. He pushed through laws that benefited both Crassus and Pompey, rewarding veterans, redistributing land, and bypassing Senate resistance by appealing directly to the people. He married his daughter Julia to Pompey, binding the alliance through blood as well as policy. It was not sentiment, it was structure. Every move had purpose, every move built toward the next. And when his consulship ended, Caesar was granted proconsular command over Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum, a vast region filled with tension, tribes, and untapped power. The Senate believed they were sending him away. In truth, they were handing him a forge. And in that forge, Caesar would shape an empire. The command Caesar received was not ordinary. It spanned years, territories, and the promise of limitless conquest. Most governors administered. Caesar would campaign. Gaul, vast, tribal, untamed, lay before him. To most Romans, Gaul was a land of barbarians, fierce warriors, thick forests, strange tongues. But to Caesar, it was the proving ground. The Republic had grown fat on conquest, and yet there were still lands that had not bowed to Rome. He would change that. He arrived in the region and immediately began organizing legions, not just gathering them, but shaping them, instilling discipline, forging loyalty, and establishing a command style rooted in presence and reward. He knew the heart of a soldier. He had once been one, and he used that knowledge like a scalpel. The Gallic Wars began with small skirmishes, local revolts, defensive measures. But Caesar escalated. He advanced further north, deeper into territory long ignored. With every village subdued, every tribe negotiated or destroyed, his legend grew. But he didn't just fight with swords. He wrote. Each campaign, each victory, each winter maneuver was recorded in his own words. Commentari de Bello Gallico. Not florid histories, but plain, deliberate reports, accessible, reproducible, distributed throughout Rome to shape public perception. The Senate saw conquest. The people saw destiny. Caesar's war in Gaul was not merely expansion, it was transformation. He broke alliances between tribes, exploited ancient rivalries, and introduced Roman infrastructure, roads, law, language. Where he passed, chaos became order, but it was order that answered to him. The most famous of these campaigns would come later, against Vercingetorix at Alesia. But even now, in the early years, the contours of empire were forming under his command. His legions adored him, not for cruelty, but for fairness, for sharing in their burdens, for speaking plainly, for never asking of them what he would not do himself. And back in Rome, Whispers began. Was Caesar becoming too powerful, too loved, too dangerous? The Senate granted him more time, more provinces. It was easier, they thought, to let him have his victories in distant lands than risk his return. But Caesar remembered. He remembered every slight, every enemy, every alliance that had turned cold. And he was not done. He was only just beginning to become the shadow they could no longer escape. Back in Rome, Caesar's name was no longer just political. It had become mythic. The Senate read his reports with a mixture of awe and dread. His victories were undeniable, his influence growing. And while they granted him extensions, allowed his campaigns to continue, they also whispered of boundaries, of limits, of fear. Pompey, once his ally through marriage and politics, had begun to drift. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, had died, a blow not just to their bond, but to the structure that kept peace between them. Without that connection, suspicion grew. Meanwhile, Caesar remained in Gaul, conquering, writing, building. He was not idle. He was calculating. Every road he paved, every law he introduced, every battle he fought, all of it pointed in one direction: Rome. Not just to return, but to return stronger than he had left, with legions at his back, with the people on his side, with the Senate unsure how to stop him. When his final campaign ended, Caesar faced a choice. His term was expiring. Roman law stated that no general could lead an army across the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Rome, without surrendering his command. To cross the Rubicon was treason. And so, in 49 BCE, under heavy skies, and with the fate of the Republic trembling in the balance, Caesar made his decision. He crossed. The die is cast, he said, and with that, history shifted. There would be no turning back. Not for Caesar, not for Rome, not for anything set in motion. This wasn't an ending. It was the edge of something vast, a moment collapsing inward, pulling history with it. The boy from Subura was gone. What remained was gravity, and from its shards, reshape civilization. The Rubicon had been crossed, not just in geography, but in identity. Rome was no longer the city Caesar served. It was the stage he now commanded. As his legions marched south, city after city opened its gates. There were no grand battles at first, only silence, fear, abandonment. Pompey and many senators fled to the east, not because Caesar outnumbered them, but because he had outmaneuvered them. Caesar moved quickly, securing Italy without bloodshed wherever possible. He entered Rome not as a tyrant, but as a liberator. He restored order, prevented looting, and began reorganizing the very institutions meant to oppose him. But the descent into civil war hasn't come yet. This is the stillness before it begins. The breath held at the edge of the break. This is the moment where all that came before meets what will come next. Where a boy raised in cracked tile and whispered prayers becomes the force behind a seismic reshaping of history. The sounds of his childhood, sandals on stone, the murmur of Latin prayers, the distant clang of market carts, are far behind now. What remains is the rhythm of legions marching in unison, of treaties signed with urgency, of a city unsure whether to cheer or fear its returning son. He was no longer forming. he was formed. And as the Republic trembled beneath the weight of its contradictions, Caesar stood at the edge of its ruin, and at the dawn of his own becoming. The sun did not rise faster because of him, but everything it touched now bore his name. There is a moment in every life when the weight of memory and momentum collide, where everything one has endured, observed, resisted, and calculated fuses into a singular direction. For Caesar, that moment had arrived. Though civil war loomed, though alliances had frayed, though the city behind him was wary, he was no longer seeking Rome's approval. He was carving its future. In the weeks that followed his crossing of the Rubicon, Caesar moved with eerie clarity. He did not rage. He did not posture. He administered. He listened. He calibrated. His letters to the Senate were firm but polite. His reforms, swift but organized. His image, crafted not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts of the people. And those people, the farmers, the veterans, the laborers, the freedmen, they remembered who had championed their grain, their debts, their dignity. To them, he was not a conqueror. He was the return of justice in armor. Meanwhile, the old guard panicked. Their world, one of hierarchy, untouchable estates, and hereditary dominance, was being eroded not by foreign invasion, but by someone born among them, who no longer obeyed them. This was no longer just politics. It was redefinition. And so, before the blades are drawn, before Pompey is pursued, before the tides of Pharsalus, Egypt, and the Ides, we pause with the wind at Caesar's back, not because the storm has passed, but because he is now the one shaping its direction. The silence before this storm is not absence, it is structure. It is the breath before the exhale. It is the final heartbeat of the world before Caesar remakes it in his name. To understand how Caesar came to command not just Rome's armies, but its very imagination, one must remember what he carried with him into every room, every camp, every forum: memory. He remembered what it meant to be hunted, to be young and without protection, to be ordered to divorce the woman he loved, to live with nothing but a name and the refusal to abandon it. He remembered Sulla's prescriptions, the lists carved into stone, men condemned not for crimes, but for loyalty to the wrong name. He remembered standing before the statue of Alexander and asking himself, "What have I done by this age?" And now, with the Rubicon behind him, and the Republic's center of gravity shifted, he carried all of that into every choice. His past was not something he escaped. It was something he sharpened. Rome had seen ambition before, but it had not seen Caesar, a man who merged vision with patience, speed with calculation, authority with storytelling. His wars were not just fought, they were narrated. His speeches were not mere declarations, they were strategies. He did not simply want to win. He wanted the world to know how he had won, and to admire the method. This too was legacy. And the Republic, already hollowed by decades of compromise and corruption, could not contain a man who played both inside and beyond its rules. Even in this pause, this breath between thunderclaps, the shape of what was coming was clear. This was no longer a tale of rising. It was the beginning of something imperial, not in name, not yet. but in the undeniable pull of one will reshaping the lives of millions. As Caesar's presence filled the vacuum of power, the people began to speak of him in tones once reserved for legends, not because of miracles or divine proclamations, but because he moved through the world with an inevitability that made resistance feel irrelevant. He wasn't simply taking power. He was revealing how hollow everything else had become. Temples still held their rights. The Senate still debated. The Republic still named its consuls. But these motions were paper held over flame, fragile symbols continuing only because Caesar allowed them to. His strength was not that he tore institutions down. It was that he made them unnecessary. Those who feared him accused him of monarchy, of despotism, of ambition too vast for the mortal sphere. But those who followed him, the legions who had marched barefoot through the snows of Gaul, the citizens whose debts he had forgiven, the veterans he had honored, they saw something else. They saw a man who remembered their names, who kept his word, who punished the corrupt and raised the humble. They saw not tyranny, they saw order. In this twilight before civil war, before declarations and assassinations, Caesar became more than a man. He became a mirror, reflecting Rome's brokenness back at itself. And in doing so, he offered an answer. Not democracy, not equality, but unity. One will, one vision, one Rome, drawn together under the quiet gravity of a boy who had once lit incense for household gods in a cracked tiled atrium, and who now lit torches for the world. What began in dust was now clothed in marble. And still, he had not yet claimed the crown. And so we return to the silence, to the moment between decision and consequence, between breath and proclamation. The Rubicon is behind him. The Senate is fractured. His enemies gather across the sea. But here, in this final hush before history accelerates, Caesar stands not as a tyrant, not as a god, but as a man who never stopped listening. To the wind, to the weight of legacy, to the quiet pulse of a world about to be remade. He does not rush. He does not tremble. His eyes, the same that once studied senators and soldiers with equal care, now scan the horizon for what must come next. This is not triumph. It is clarity, the kind that only arrives when all illusions have fallen away. He walks through the colonnades of Rome, past statues of those who came before him, Romulus, Brutus, Scipio, Marius. Their marble eyes do not follow him, but their stories do. Each a chapter in the book he now holds open. He knows how their pages end, and he is writing something else. The people cheer, the Senate stalls, the generals wait. But Caesar prepares, not for war, but for permanence. A form of power that does not vanish when the sword is sheathed or the laws are changed. A legacy doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums beneath the surface, shaping everything long after the voice that set it in motion has fallen silent. The boy who once watched Rome with wide eyes is gone now. In his place stands something quieter, sharper, a man not chasing titles, but preparing for something more dangerous than ambition, inevitability. The Republic stands, and time waits. And still, the streets of Rome do not know what is coming. Children chase one another past temples and markets. Priests perform their rites. Senators whisper behind pillars. Merchants tally their coins. Slaves carry amphorae beneath porticos painted with fading myths. They do not yet realize that they live at the edge of one age and the beginning of another. This is how history always feels in the moment, ordinary. But around Caesar, ordinary bends. He does not speak of empire. He does not wear a crown. He makes no boast. Yet his footsteps echo a little longer than they should. His presence shifts the posture of crowds. His name leaves hesitation in its wake. There is power in restraint. And he knows this. The world remembers those who acted when others waited, who stood still while others panicked, who crossed rivers, not because they were forced to, but because they knew they could not stay. In the final hours, we remain in the breath between empire and republic, between command and consequence, between myth and man. Caesar is not yet eternal, but he has become inevitable. One last glance, not from Caesar, but from us, at the city that bore him, at the family that shaped him, at the boy who became history by refusing to stop moving forward, even when everything around him told him to stand still. The Republic will not survive what comes next. But its greatest transformation was not its fall. It was this moment of stillness, before the march, before the crown, before the knife, before the world would say his name for 2,000 years and still not fully understand the cost of what he became. When Caesar first looked upon the lands of Gaul, it was not with the eyes of a general seeking glory, nor a governor fulfilling duty, but with the quiet intensity of a man who saw in the wild edges of empire a mirror for his own ambition. Gaul was vast, forested, tribal, unsubdued. The Romans had long seen it as a land of danger, its people fierce, its terrain unyielding. For centuries they had pushed into its borders, skirmishing with tribes, trading along rivers, but never claiming it as fully Roman. Now, it fell under Caesar's command, not only Cisalpine Gaul, the fertile crescent north of Italy, but Transalpine Gaul and Illyricum as well. 3 provinces, multiple legions, nearly unlimited authority. He was given 5 years. He would need nearly 10. When Caesar arrived, he found more than enemies. He found a canvas. It began in 58 BCE, when the Helvetii, a large Gallic tribe, began migrating westward, hoping to escape Germanic incursions. Their movement threatened Roman allies and trade routes. Caesar intercepted them, demanded their halt, and when negotiations failed, engaged them near Bibracte. It was not merely a victory, it was an announcement. Rome was not retreating from Gaul, it was claiming it. The Helvetii were defeated, their migration halted, and Caesar, sensing opportunity, turned his attention to the rest of the region. His dispatches back to Rome, written in the third person, deceptively simple, coolly factual, became his greatest weapon. Commentari de Bello Gallico was not a diary. It was a campaign of persuasion, a masterpiece of messaging. In every report, Caesar appeared calm, rational, provoked but measured. His enemies were barbaric, his intentions noble. The truth, far more complex, lived in the spaces between sentences. He described not just battles, but the culture of the Gauls, their war customs, their chieftains, their political assemblies. It was part anthropological record, part imperial justification, and it worked. Back in Rome, The people read his words with fascination, the Senate with unease. Caesar's name was everywhere, on scrolls, in speeches, whispered in taverns. He was no longer a politician on campaign. He was becoming the voice of Roman destiny beyond the Alps. But Gaul would not fall easily, and Caesar did not want it to, because in conquest he found his truest form, and in resistance he found the shape of his legend. The tribes of Gaul were many, and they were not united. They spoke different dialects, worshipped different gods, and held alliances as loosely as weapons. What Caesar understood, what so many before him had failed to grasp, was that Gaul did not need to be beaten all at once. It needed to be broken apart. Divide and conquer was not simply a Roman tactic. It was Caesar's obsession. He began cultivating relationships with select tribes, offering protection, recognition, coin. To others, he sent warnings. Sometimes he allowed rivalries to boil over without interference. Sometimes he stoked them. Always he watched. Always he positioned his legions just near enough to be ready, and just far enough to seem disinterested. In 57 BCE, he moved against the Belgae, a fierce confederation of northern tribes who had begun to resist Roman expansion. Caesar struck quickly, defeating them in a series of campaigns that showcased not only his strategic brilliance, but his ruthless adaptability. His legions marched through dense forests, forded icy rivers, built siege works overnight. When conventional tactics failed, he invented new ones. His engineers became legends in their own right, crafting bridges, fortifications, siege towers, and trenches with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. To his soldiers, Caesar was both architect and avatar. To his enemies, he was the storm. Yet he remained, in his writings, curiously detached. He wrote of victories in measured tones, of enemy leaders captured or slain, of villages pacified. There was no rage in his words, no triumphalism, only inevitability. But those who marched with him knew otherwise. They saw the gleam in his eyes before battle. They heard the calm urgency in his voice. They watched how he rode among them, not behind. He slept in tents, ate the same food, bled when wounded. Caesar's army did not merely fight for pay, they fought for him. And in Gaul, that bond, forged in mud, fire, and frost, became unbreakable. By 56 BCE, Caesar had already subdued vast portions of Gaul. But conquest is not merely about territory, it is about narrative. And Caesar was shaping one more deliberately than any military maneuver. He understood that every battle had two fronts, one on the ground and one in the minds of those watching from afar. To Rome, he projected order, civilization. He described the Gauls as noble but wild, brave but lacking discipline, people who needed Rome's guidance, its justice, its gods. The Senate grew uneasy. His popularity was growing too fast, his reach too wide. Yet each new dispatch, each scroll unfurled in the forum, painted Caesar not as a tyrant, but as a guardian of Roman destiny. Behind those carefully chosen words, the legions continued their grind. That year, he returned to Italy briefly to renew the first triumvirate. In Lucca, he met with Pompey and Crassus. They agreed to support one another's ambitions. Caesar would remain in Gaul for another 5 years. Pompey and Crassus would secure the consulship. It was not a meeting of friends. It was an arrangement of necessity. They smiled, clasped arms, shared meals, but trust had long since frayed. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, had died, and with her, the fragile bond between the two men had begun to dissolve. Still, Caesar returned to Gaul with legitimacy extended, and a deeper sense that time was running out. The tribes had not been idle in his absence. New coalitions were forming, dissent simmered, and across the Rhine, Germanic tribes loomed. Caesar saw not a setback, but an opportunity. He would cross the river, into lands that Rome had never dared to hold, not because it was necessary, but because it was unimaginable. In 55 BCE, Caesar did what few Roman commanders had ever attempted. He crossed the Rhine. The Germanic tribes, long regarded as unpredictable and untamable, had occasionally raided across the river. To Rome, they were more myth than threat, a looming shadow beyond the frontier. But Caesar refused to be contained by myth. With astonishing speed, he ordered a bridge built across the Rhine, not a temporary crossing, but a statement of dominance. In just 10 days, his engineers constructed a timber span capable of carrying legions, cavalry, and supply trains across one of Europe's most formidable rivers. He led his men into Germania, engaged no major battles, and returned after only a few weeks. The objective was not conquest. It was message. Rome could go anywhere. Caesar would go anywhere. Back in Gaul, the situation continued to shift. Tribes were watching, waiting, adapting. The Usipetes and Tencteri, Germanic groups displaced by conflict, attempted to settle in Gallic territory. Caesar met with them under the pretense of negotiation, but when he perceived deceit, he attacked without warning, routing them decisively. The move drew criticism, even in Rome. But Caesar did not explain himself. He wrote, briefly, coldly, factually. The enemy had moved. He had responded. The campaign continued. Later that year, he would do the unthinkable again, an expedition across the Channel into Britannia. The Romans knew of the island, but had never sent an army. Caesar's crossing was plagued by storms, poor intelligence, and fierce resistance. His forces made landfall, skirmished with British tribes, and returned without securing lasting control. To some, it was a failure. To Caesar, it was theatre. He had crossed another boundary, stepped onto another map. He was expanding more than empire. He was expanding imagination. The Gallic Wars were not a single campaign. They were a symphony, years of movement, reaction, recalibration. Caesar adapted to changing landscapes, unpredictable weather, betrayals, alliances, and uprisings. Each season brought new challenges, each challenge a new innovation. By 54 BCE, Caesar returned to Britannia, this time with more preparation, better ships, greater numbers. The invasion went deeper inland, and several tribes submitted. Yet again, storms ravaged his fleet, and he chose not to press further. He left a mark. He left a warning. The British would remember the eagle standards glimpsed in fog and rain for generations. But back in Gaul, the real storm was forming. The tribes, weary of Roman domination, began to murmur. In the winter of 54 to 53 BCE, the Eburones, led by Ambiorix, launched a surprise assault on a Roman encampment. The result was catastrophic. A legion was destroyed, one of the few times Caesar suffered a true loss. He responded not with fury, but with meticulous devastation. He spent the next months hunting Ambiorix. He destroyed villages, seized supplies, dismantled tribal strongholds. His vengeance was not wild, it was systematic. But it was only a preview of what would come. Because in the distance, another leader was rising. Vercingetorix, a chieftain of the Arverni, young, ambitious, and charismatic. He understood what others had not, that Caesar could not be defeated in the field alone. He had to be overwhelmed with unity. For the first time in years, dozens of Gallic tribes began to speak as one. Their languages remained different, their rituals remained separate, but their goal became singular: break Caesar and reclaim Gaul. It was 52 BCE, and the air in Gaul was different. Villages once willing to negotiate had grown silent. Envoys vanished. Supply routes were harassed or blocked. Caesar sensed the change before it fully emerged, and when it did, it confirmed his fears. Vercingetorix had succeeded. He had rallied the tribes, not all, but enough to pose a force larger than anything Caesar had faced in years. This was no longer a campaign. It was a rebellion. Vercingetorix did not seek battle immediately. He adopted a strategy of scorched earth, destroying his own people's fields, supply caches, and fortifications so that Caesar's forces would march hungry. The Romans pursued him through harsh terrain, forced to travel faster and thinner than before. In Gergovia, Caesar suffered a rare defeat. It was not catastrophic, but it bruised his momentum. His legions, for the first time, questioned. His allies hesitated, but Caesar did not retreat. He adjusted. As summer deepened, the Gallic leader made one final error. He took refuge in the fortified hill city of Alesia. Caesar seized the opportunity. What followed was not merely a siege. It was a feat of military engineering unmatched in its time. Caesar ordered the construction of not one, but two massive rings of fortifications, one to keep Vercingetorix inside, the other to defend against Gallic reinforcements from the outside. It was a gamble. Caesar was outnumbered. His troops were stretched. Supplies were running low, but the structure held. When the final Gallic assault came, it pushed the Romans to the edge, but not beyond it. Reinforcements failed. Morale broke. Vercingetorix, proud and beaten, rode from the gates of Alesia and surrendered in silence. He laid down his sword before Caesar and said nothing. He did not need to. The war had ended. The surrender at Alesia marked more than the end of a campaign. It marked the end of Gallic resistance as a unified force. Tribes that had once stood shoulder to shoulder scattered, returned to negotiations, or vanished into the forests. Vercingetorix, once hailed as the unifier, was taken prisoner and eventually paraded through Rome in chains during Caesar's future triumph. But long before that spectacle, Caesar remained in Gaul, not as a conqueror celebrating victory, but as an administrator reshaping an entire region. He restructured tribal boundaries, enforced Roman taxation, and began introducing Roman customs, law, and currency into daily life. Roads were extended, garrisons built, temples to Roman gods raised beside older Gallic altars. Latin inscriptions replaced tribal markings on stone. The pace was relentless. Even in peace, Caesar worked as if war still raged. His soldiers, worn but loyal, remained stationed across the territories. They collected grain, enforced law, and served as living symbols of what Rome had become under Caesar's will: efficient, ordered, and ever expanding. He did not return to Rome immediately. There was still too much to finish. The memory of rebellion still lingered in the trees. Resistance was not yet extinguished, only scattered. And Caesar, ever cautious, ever aware, preferred to finish things himself. It was not merely victory he desired, it was permanence. And so, for several more years, he remained, settling disputes, overseeing construction, dispatching envoys to distant tribes, and writing. Always writing. The commentary continued, chronicling not just military feats, but civil reforms, cultural observations, and strategic justifications. Rome was not simply reading about Gaul, it was being taught how to think about it, and Caesar was the teacher. Caesar's final years in Gaul were marked not by grand battles, but by consolidation. He moved swiftly through regions that once bristled with resistance, now quiet under the weight of Rome's new infrastructure. The legions constructed watchtowers on hills, laid roads through marshlands, and dug canals to support grain flow across provinces. Fortresses rose from the earth in geometric lines, their walls echoing Roman symmetry and permanence. Even the architecture spoke. This land is no longer wild. Yet the wildness was not entirely gone. Small uprisings flared and were extinguished. Banditry persisted. A handful of tribes tried to renegotiate old terms, believing Caesar's attention had shifted. But they found that even in the quiet, Caesar's reach remained long. His scouts moved like shadows. His punishments, when necessary, were swift and calculated. He governed with the same clarity he had once used to conquer. But the real battle was no longer in Gaul. It was in Rome. News reached him of growing opposition. The Senate had begun to question the scope of his command. His enemies, chief among them Pompey, were consolidating influence. Old allies had turned quiet. His name, once cheered without hesitation, was now invoked with caution. Admiration had turned to fear, and Caesar knew fear better than most. He had worn it as a boy, running from Sulla's reach. He had smelled it on the breath of Gallic prisoners, trembling before their fate. And now he recognized it again, not in himself, but in the voice of the Senate, calling for his return, not to celebrate, but to surrender command. Rome was no longer asking politely, it was warning. And Caesar was listening. In the waning light of his command, Caesar stood at a crossroads more dangerous than any battlefield. His victories in Gaul had been absolute, his reforms widespread, his fame unmatched. But power, once gained, rarely sleeps, and the Senate feared that Caesar would not return as a citizen, but as a sovereign. They demanded he relinquish his command before crossing back into Italy. To Caesar, this was not a request. It was a trap. Without his army, he would be vulnerable, prosecuted, possibly exiled, maybe worse. And so he waited, not with indecision, but with calculation. He reviewed his legions, veterans who had followed him for nearly a decade, men who had marched through rain, snow, blood. They were not mercenaries, they were not conscripts. They were loyal, not to Rome, but to him, He knew what he could ask of them. He also knew what it would cost. In 50 BCE, tensions peaked. Debates in the Senate spiraled. Pompey was given extraordinary powers to protect the Republic. It was no longer politics. It was war by another name. And so, on the night of January 10th, 49 BCE, Caesar made his decision. He approached the Rubicon River, the legal boundary no general was allowed to cross with an army. He stood in silence. The men beside him watched. Then he crossed. No fanfare, just forward motion. The phrase he spoke would echo through centuries. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. The Gallic wars were over. But Caesar's war, the one for Rome itself, had just begun. With the Rubicon behind him and the Republic before him, Caesar stepped into a Rome that no longer recognized itself. Gaul had forged him, but it was Rome that would define him. He marched south, not with plunder or grand spectacle, but with precision. Cities opened their gates without resistance. His reputation preceded him. Some called him savior, others tyrant. All understood that something irreversible had begun. The Senate scattered. Pompey fled east, and Caesar, for all his control, did not celebrate. He knew the hardest war had only begun, not of swords, but of stories, of who would write the future and who would be written out of it. Gaul had taught him that victory was not just survival, but shaping the narrative around it. And so, even as he pursued Pompey, even as civil war erupted across provinces, Caesar carried Gaul with him, not just in memory, but in the very way he governed, strategized, and moved. He had learned patience from its winters, boldness from its rebellions, loyalty from the men who fought beside him. And now, in the crucible of civil conflict, all those lessons would be tested anew. The campaign in Gaul was over, but its imprint was permanent. It had made him more than a general. It had made him inevitable. Though the legions no longer marched through Gallic soil, their echoes remained. The veterans returned to Italy, many of them granted land or pensions as promised. They came back not as nameless soldiers, but as hardened men who had carried Rome's eagle through wilderness, through revolt, through a storm of history that only they could truly understand. Some settled near the very roads they had built. Others were absorbed into Caesar's personal guard, a brotherhood stronger than iron. But the memory of Gaul, its forests, its fires, its cries, stayed behind their eyes. And in Caesar, it lived deeper still. Gaul had not been a distraction. It had been his crucible. It taught him how to see beyond structure, beyond orders, beyond even tradition. In Gaul, he had learned the psychology of resistance. He had faced hunger, mutiny, betrayal, and prevailed not just by force, but by rhythm, by timing, by listening. Now, with Rome unraveling around him, he returned to those lessons. He moved fast when others stalled. He negotiated when others threatened. He acted when others doubted. Even as Pompey rallied forces across the Adriatic, Caesar made clear his aim was not destruction, it was restoration. But what he meant to restore was not the Republic. It was Rome itself, reborn in new form. And Gaul, the conquest, the victories, the reforms, had all been prelude. The real transformation was yet to come. Years later, when scholars would try to make sense of Caesar's rise, they would speak of Rubicon crossings and Senate debates. But those who truly understood knew that the seed was planted in Gaul. There, far from marble steps and temple columns, Caesar had built something invisible yet indestructible: belief. Belief in his leadership, in his judgment, in his inevitability. He did not need a crown. His victories wore it for him. As the world held its breath between the old order and the new, we do not close with conquest, but with quiet. Caesar sits in a command tent beneath foreign stars. The scent of pine and damp earth lingers in the canvas folds. Scrolls lie open beside a flickering lamp. Outside, the last embers of a cook fire hiss in the night wind. There is no cheering crowd, only silence, only stillness, because even now he is listening to history, to fate, to what must come next. This is where Gaul ends, not with an explosion, but with a hand slowly closing over the reins of something vast. The tribes have been silenced, the provinces redrawn, and the man who once walked through the crowded alleys of the Subura now watches as the entire world bends toward his next breath. He does not yet call himself ruler. He does not need to. He has become the center of gravity, and all of Rome is falling toward him. Those who met Caesar in these final years of the Gallic command often described his calm. He did not speak more loudly than others. He did not rush. But when he entered a room, the energy shifted. Conversations paused. Decisions followed. That presence, the quiet gravitational pull, had been forged in the forests and rivers of Gaul, not by titles, but by actions, not by force alone, but by consistency. A leader whose every choice moved with a rhythm deeper than politics. The Roman elite feared him because he had become the exception to their rulebook. He had shown that legacy was not inherited, it was sculpted, with action, with risk, with the willingness to be misunderstood. And so in the shadows, we return not to the campaigns, but to the man himself, seated in thought, remembering every name etched in stone along his march, every village burned, every oath sworn in the cold, every man buried with honor or consequence, not because he mourned, but because he remembered. Caesar's greatest strength was not vision, it was retention. He never forgot, and Rome would never again be allowed to forget him. The Gaul that Caesar left behind was no longer the Gaul he had entered. It had been mapped, measured, taxed, restructured, its languages diluted, its gods dethroned, its warriors buried or bent beneath Roman law. The land still breathed, but now it breathed to Rome's rhythm. And yet, even as he prepared to depart, Caesar understood what few others did. The conquest of land is not the same as the conquest of memory. He knew that myths would rise to fill the silence he left, that stories would be twisted, that motives would be reinterpreted. And so he kept writing, not for vanity, for permanence. Each line in his commentaries served as both record and defense, a carefully carved stone in the monument he was building of himself. Not a tomb, a template, because in Caesar's mind, Gaul was never just about territory, it was about transformation, not of a people, but of a man, from fugitive to commander, from executor of Rome's will to its embodiment. The Senate still debated over titles, over laws, over tradition. But Caesar had already stepped beyond those limits, and Gaul had been the crucible that melted the last fragments of restraint. He no longer asked what was allowed. He decided what would be remembered. He no longer needed permission. Caesar's authority by now did not rest on decree or consensus. It rested on evidence, on what he had done, on what no one else had dared to do. Every province subdued, every tribe broken or bound, every legion loyal beyond reason. Even his critics could not argue with the results. They tried to slow him with laws. He rewrote the law through action. They tried to contain him with titles. He stepped beyond titles with silence. There is a kind of power that comes not from violence, but from inevitability, from the sense that the world has already adjusted itself to a new shape, and that shape bears one name. In this final breath, we no longer walk beside Caesar. We orbit him, and Rome does too. The streets still whisper, the Senate still resists, but beneath it all, a truth grows louder than any proclamation. Gaul is his, the legions are his, and soon, whether by law or by war, Rome will be his as well. There is a silence after victory that feels almost sacred. No drums, no declarations, just the slow exhale of a world that has changed. Caesar stood in that silence. He didn't shout. He didn't rush to claim credit. He knew that history was watching, and history, he had learned, prefers steadiness. As he prepared to return from Gaul, the transition began not with parades, but with letters, orders, movements, a shifting of gears so subtle, most did not recognize it for what it was, the beginning of the end for the Republic as it had been. He released some legions from service, granting them land, not just as reward, but as strategy. Their loyalty would ripple outward through towns and farms, anchoring his influence in soil. He sent gifts back to Rome, not gaudy treasures, but symbols, finely wrought weapons, rare animals, artifacts of conquest that could adorn temples and public squares, tokens that reminded the people who had made peace possible. He kept writing, not to glorify, to control, because stories shape power longer than any sword can. The commentaries became smoother, more reflective, less about war, more about order, as if to prepare the people for a leader who no longer conquered by force, but by suggestion. This was no longer Caesar the general. This was Caesar the architect, not just of bridges or borders, but of a new kind of Rome, and he was nearly ready to build it. But Rome was not waiting with open arms. Whispers had grown louder. Senators aligned against him. Pompey, once friend and ally, had become symbol and sword of the opposition. The Senate issued decrees demanding Caesar disband his army and return alone. It was never about law. It was about fear. They feared the loyalty he commanded. They feared the calm precision with which he moved. They feared that he had already won, and they were only now realizing it. Caesar read the demands carefully, folded the parchment, and sat in silence. He did not rage. He calculated. Every river crossed, every hill fortified, Every campaign waged in Gaul had led to this. It had not been random. It had been design. Each conquest, each province, each report home, pieces of a larger shape. Now the outline was clear. And Caesar, patient, steady, focused, had no intention of stepping back. He looked to the legions still camped with him, the veterans who had crossed the Rhine, scaled the walls at Alesia, marched through the bogs of Britannia. They did not need to be asked. When he turned toward Rome, they followed. Not for gold, not for plunder, but because they had already seen what he could build, and they believed he would build it again. The road back to Rome was not lined with flowers. It was lined with questions. Would the people rise? Would the Senate resist? Would the gods permit this reshaping of their city? But Caesar did not look to omens. He looked to timing. He moved with the pace of inevitability, never rushing, never halting. He gave the Senate chances to reconsider. He offered negotiation. He framed his return not as a challenge, but as a correction. And yet, each step forward made compromise harder. By the time his legions neared the Rubicon, the question was no longer if he would return. It was how Rome would respond. And so in this moment, poised between two worlds, the conquest of Gaul had ended, but the consequences had only just begun. Caesar no longer needed to fight. He had already created the conditions in which resistance collapsed on contact. The new Rome was not waiting to be born. It had already taken its first breath. And Caesar, shaped by every stone road, every tribal treaty, every winter in foreign lands, stood ready to claim it. At the edge of the Republic, on the final night before history turned, the campfires of Caesar's army burned low. The men did not speak loudly. They sharpened blades, adjusted armor, slept with one eye open. They knew something rare was about to happen. Not a battle, but a beginning. Some would not live to see the end of what Caesar was about to start. But that had never been the point. They believed even then that they were part of something that would outlive them. And Caesar, in his tent, pacing slowly beneath torchlight, was not drafting war plans. He was thinking about foundations. He was thinking about what Rome could become, not under the Senate, not under chaos, but under structure, under clarity, under vision. And when he finally lay down to rest, eyes closed to the stars beyond the canvas, he did not wonder if he would succeed. He only wondered what form that success would take. The legions would rise at first light, and with them, the new Rome. Gaul had been Caesar's forge, but the Rome he now approached, fragile, divided, desperate, would be the anvil. He had learned in those northern campaigns that endurance was not enough, nor force, nor fear. What lasted was structure. What triumphed was the capacity to bend the world into coherence. That was what he carried with him now. Not gold, not glory, but method. And method, once set into motion, becomes momentum. The men behind him were not marching for conquest. They were marching because they could not imagine following anyone else. Rome waited. And Caesar, eyes forward, steps measured, did not wonder whether it would receive him. He wondered how long it would take for it to understand it already had. The war in Gaul had ended, but its legacy was only just beginning, not in the smoke of burning villages, but in the silence before the future is written. This is how empires turn, not with fire, but with footsteps. A man crosses a river, a city pauses, a silence deepens, and then, without fanfare, without thunder, history takes a new shape. It does not ask permission. It does not wait for applause. It simply becomes, and so too did Caesar. And Rome, whether ready or not, would never be the same again. The Rubicon was behind him, not just the river, but the moment. That small strip of water, narrow, cold, unremarkable, had become the threshold between republic and empire, between politics and war, between who Caesar had been and what he would now become. He crossed it without hesitation, and the world held its breath. Rome was not ready. The Senate, fractured and frantic, issued decrees too late. Pompey, once Caesar's son-in-law and closest ally, had fled. The city emptied of leadership, filled instead with rumor and fear. No battles were fought in the streets. But something broke. A trust, a structure, a rhythm that had held the Republic together, despite all its contradictions. Caesar marched not with fire, but with silence. His legions moved through the countryside with discipline, taking cities not by siege, but by surrender. His name was enough. His reputation had marched ahead of him. The people remembered. They remembered the grain subsidies, the debt reforms, the laws passed in defiance of elite stagnation. They remembered the general who ate with his men, who slept on the ground beside them, who returned from Gaul not in triumphal procession, but in formation. He was not asking for power. He was returning for it. And Rome, confused, fragmented, trembling, was already starting to give it to him. Pompey had not expected him to move so fast. He believed Caesar would hesitate, that he would negotiate, that fear of civil war would slow his pace. But Caesar had spent years in Gaul learning the value of momentum. Speed wins more than strength. So when Pompey withdrew to Brundisium, hoping to gather his forces and flee across the sea to Greece, Caesar pursued. Not recklessly, but relentlessly. He laid siege to the port, blockaded the exits, but Pompey escaped, barely, sailing into the fog with the weight of the Senate on his back. Caesar entered Rome not as a conqueror, but as a surgeon. He cleaned the wounds of bureaucracy, reopened temples, called for grain, stabilized the treasury. The city had not fallen, it had been abandoned, and he made sure the people knew who had stayed to hold it together. But this was no triumph. The real war was not yet fought. In Hispania, Pompeian forces gathered, loyal to the old order, to the Republic in name if not in practice. Caesar turned west. The campaign was brutal, not because the enemy was stronger, but because the land itself resisted. Harsh terrain, thin supply lines, skirmishes in valleys and gorges. His legions, tired from years of marching, fought not just soldiers, but fatigue. And yet, they won. Again. Not because they were invincible, because they remembered who they followed. It was not bloodlust that drove Caesar. It was closure. The Republic had become theatre. senators speaking grand words while armies moved in the shadows. Caesar wanted no more ambiguity, no more waiting. He turned his attention east, to Greece, to Pompeii. The journey was not easy. The seas were treacherous. Storms scattered his fleet. He landed in Epirus with a fraction of his legions and no clear path to supplies. Still, he advanced. Pompey waited with a larger force, better provisioned, well entrenched, confident. The standoff dragged on for months. Skirmishes flared, then quieted. Diplomats moved between camps. Letters crossed borders, but no peace came. At Pharsalus, in 48 BCE, the waiting ended. Pompey positioned his forces with precision, expecting Caesar to falter. He had cavalry superiority. He had the high ground. But Caesar had something else: adaptability. He thinned his lines, restructured his flank, placed hidden reserves where no one thought to look. When Pompey's cavalry charged, they met not disarray, but a wall of silent infantry. The tide turned, and then it broke. Pompey's forces collapsed. Thousands surrendered. Others fled. Pompey himself escaped to Egypt, seeking refuge, only to be met with betrayal. He was assassinated upon arrival by those who feared being seen as enemies of Caesar. Caesar arrived in Egypt days later. He did not expect peace. He found a throne fractured by succession. The boy king Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra were locked in a civil struggle for power. Egypt, though technically independent, was entangled in Roman politics and debt. Caesar, always the strategist, chose clarity. He backed Cleopatra, not only because of her intelligence, or the allure history would later romanticize, but because she understood diplomacy. She knew Caesar needed stability, and she offered it. The palace intrigue that followed was dense with deception. Ptolemy's forces besieged the royal quarter where Caesar and Cleopatra sheltered. Fires spread, ships were sunk. The Library of Alexandria, a monument to centuries of knowledge, partially burned during the chaos. And yet, Caesar held. Reinforcements arrived. The siege broke. Ptolemy drowned trying to escape. Cleopatra emerged victorious. She was placed on the throne beside her younger brother, a symbolic gesture of unity. But in truth, power now flowed through her and through Caesar. Their alliance deepened, personally, politically, historically. Cleopatra would later bear him a son, Caesarion. But even then, in the luxury of Egypt, Caesar did not forget Rome. He was not there to rule a kingdom. He was there to finish a transformation. While the Nile flowed calm, the Republic churned with unrest. Rome had not collapsed in Caesar's absence, but it had not stabilized either. Senators whispered of dictatorship. Opponents gathered remnants of Pompey's legions. Uprisings flared in Africa, in Asia Minor, in the corners of a republic that no longer recognized its own reflection. And Caesar, ever watchful, returned not in procession, but with precision. He moved quickly. Africa first. The remnants of Pompey's forces, led by Cato and Metellus Scipio, had regrouped in Utica. Caesar crossed the sea, marched through hostile terrain, and met them at Thapsus. The battle was decisive. Caesar's elephants broke through enemy lines. Panic spread. Thousands were cut down. Cato, the stoic voice of the Republic's dying ideals, chose suicide over surrender. Back in Rome, the news stirred unease. There were no longer two sides, only Caesar, and those who remembered a time before him. But he did not gloat. He legislated. He passed reforms, calendar revisions, debt relief, colonial resettlement. He filled Senate vacancies, including some from the provinces. Critics called it stacking. Supporters called it inclusion. He called it Rome, evolving. Because it had to. In the streets of Rome, statues were raised, not as monuments to conquest, but to continuity. Caesar knew the Republic was gone, not by his hand alone, but by decades of erosion, corruption, stagnation, gridlock. He simply refused to pretend otherwise. So he acted. He reduced the number of citizens reliant on grain subsidies, expanded the Senate to reflect the empire, not just the city, reorganized municipal laws, planned new roads, new colonies, new trade routes. Every act of reform, a brick in the architecture of a future he would never call by name. But everyone else could see it. The word lingered like smoke after a torch is snuffed. King. He rejected it publicly, mocked the idea, insisted he was still only consul, still only dictator in times of emergency. But the crown hovered, and his enemies saw it, not as threat, but as prophecy. Even his allies began to wonder, would he stop? Could he? He was not staging a coup. He was reweaving the fabric, not tearing it apart, but stretching it until the pattern changed. And though he never wore the crown, Rome was already kneeling. In early 44 BCE, the Senate offered him what many believed he had long desired, the title of Dictator for life. He accepted it. And something shifted, not in him, in everyone else. Until then, his power had moved like a tide, inevitable, but soft. Now it became declaration. Now it had a name, and names once spoken carry weight heavier than deeds. The people celebrated, the aristocracy recoiled. And a small group of senators, some friends, some rivals, some recent beneficiaries of Caesar's favour, began to meet in secret. They spoke of liberty, of restoring the Republic, of one final act to unmake the man who had unmade their world. Caesar, meanwhile, worked. He planned campaigns in Parthia, drew new maps, drafted legal reforms, walked the marble corridors of Rome not as a tyrant, but as a builder with too little time. He dismissed rumours of plots, not because he was arrogant, because he was tired. He believed he had given Rome everything, and in return, he asked only to finish what he had started. But history does not trade in fairness, it trades in symbols. And Caesar had become the most powerful one alive. The Ides of March arrived with sunlight. Caesar woke early. The day was filled with ceremony, a session of the Senate, rituals, speeches. He was urged to stay home. A soothsayer had warned him. His wife dreamed of blood. The sky, some said, had shifted in hue, but he laughed it off. He was tired of omens, tired of whispers, tired of watching every shadow like a blade. So he walked to the Senate, unarmed, unescorted, because a man who builds does not expect destruction from those he built with. Inside the theatre of Pompeii, they waited. Brutus, Cassius, more than 60 in total, some with personal grudges, others with desperate hope. They surrounded him not with swords drawn, but with appeals, with false petitions, with lowered eyes and trembling hands. Then steel, 23 wounds, no cries for mercy, no grand speech, no resistance, just silence. Some say he spoke to Brutus. Et tu. Others say he said nothing, but all agree he fell at the base of a statue of Pompeii. And the man who had reshaped Rome with discipline, with vision, with law, died not on a battlefield, but at the feet of a legacy he thought he had transcended. The news spread through Rome like a broken fever. Caesar was dead, but the Republic did not return. There were no cheers in the streets, no grand restoration, only fear, only chaos. His assassins, expecting gratitude, found locked doors and turned faces. They had not killed a tyrant. They had killed the structure that held the storm at bay. The people mourned, not just the man, but the meaning. Because Caesar had become more than flesh. He was the architect of order, the provider of grain, the shield against collapse. Without him, nothing felt stable. Antony moved quickly. He delivered a funeral oration not of sorrow, but of ignition. He read Caesar's will aloud, its generosity, its clarity, its devotion to the people. He held the blood-stained toga aloft, and with each word, the crowd swelled, cried, roared. The funeral became a riot. The assassins fled the city. Rome burned, not in celebration, but in confusion. In the void, a new struggle began, not of ideology, but of inheritance. Who would carry Caesar's name? Who would carry his future? And who would dare to try to be what he had been? The answer came not from senators or soldiers. It came from a teenager. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew, adopted son, named heir, 17 years old when the will was read, thin, pale, bookish, dismissed by many, but not for long. He took the name Caesar, not in ambition, but in obligation. And with that name came gravity. He joined forces with Antony, then with Lepidus. They formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal body with absolute power. Prescriptions returned, enemies named, fortunes seized. Blood ran not for reform, but for revenge. Brutus and Cassius, the last faces Caesar saw, died by their own hands after defeat in the East. Rome did not weep, it braced, because the name Caesar had survived, and it was no longer a name. It was a system. Octavian played the long game. He maneuvered, waited, let Antony destroy himself in the arms of Cleopatra, then struck. At Actium, in 31 BCE, the war ended, not with a roar, but with precision. Antony and Cleopatra, defeated, took their lives, and Octavian returned home not as a triumvir, not as a boy, but as Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and Caesar's truest legacy. Caesar had never called himself emperor. He had refused crowns, mocked titles, insisted on tradition. But his life reshaped everything, not with declaration, but with demonstration. He had shown Rome that stability required structure, That vision required courage. That reform required momentum. He didn't just take power, he made it necessary. And so, in the decades after his death, Rome looked less like a republic reborn and more like Caesar remembered. Laws streamlined, provinces governed centrally, Senate neutered by procedure and presence, temples restored, but now in honor of a single man's lineage. Augustus, clever beyond his years, never undid Caesar's blueprint. He refined it, softened the edges, disguised the throne with marble and metaphor, and the people, weary of war, weary of waiting, accepted it. Because what Caesar had done in life, what he had built in blood, in legislation, in discipline, became the foundation of an empire. He had not sought kingship. He had simply made everything before him feel unfinished. And Rome, once fractured, once proud, once balanced on the edge, now rested on a single name. Caesar, no longer a man, now a lineage, now a system, now a symbol too powerful to die. Long after his death, Caesar's presence lingered not just in statues or stories, but in structure. His calendar still marked the days. His name became a title: Kaiser, Tsar, Emperor. The world had not buried him. It had inherited him. And yet, in quieter places, in libraries, in scrolls, in whispered conversations among philosophers, another question remained. What would have happened had he stopped? Had he returned to private life? Had he let the Republic breathe again? But Rome did not reward retreat. It rewarded motion. And Caesar had never been still. He had governed not as a man desperate for power, but as one unwilling to leave things broken. Flawed, yes, but also brave. And that bravery, that refusal to compromise with decay, made him dangerous. Because he showed what was possible. And what is possible always threatens what is comfortable. So now, in the stillness of centuries later, we do not study Caesar merely to remember. We study him to understand how systems shift, how names become nations, and how one man, moving forward while others stalled, bent the arc of an empire into permanence. There's a reason his name endures, not just in titles or timelines, but in the structure of power itself. Caesar proved that clarity can be more revolutionary than rebellion, that showing up again and again, with order, with logic, with motion, changes everything. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a system. Every law he passed, every province he structured, every calendar day he set in stone, all of it still lives in the background of what we call civilization. That is the true transformation. Not a crown, not a statue, but the quiet persistence of structure long after the man has vanished. Even now, his name carries weight, not because of mystique, but because of infrastructure, because the scaffolding he built never fully came down. Rome, in the end, never went back. It moved forward with his shadow. And centuries later, when others rose to seize power, they did not compare themselves to kings. They compared themselves to Caesar, because he did not just lead Rome, He redesigned what it meant to rule. In his final moments, Caesar may not have seen the full arc of what he'd created, but he had seen far enough. He knew that the old republic could not bear the weight of a growing world, that rituals and rhetoric were not enough, that structure had to evolve, and he offered that evolution, not perfectly, not gently, but decisively. The Senate feared him not because he broke rules, but because he replaced them with something that worked. Efficiency, predictability, presence. He governed in a language everyone understood. Action. And that, above all, is what endures. Rome's temples have fallen, its gods forgotten, its legions long dissolved. But Caesar's rhythm, his sense of how a state must move, adapt, respond, echoes in capitals around the world. His legacy is not marble, it's motion, because systems are not built on speeches. They are built on the discipline to keep going, to keep building, to keep shaping the future even when the past demands your return. And Caesar never returned. He only moved forward. His enemies tried to erase him with a blade, but Rome did not bleed him out. It absorbed him. The month of his birth was renamed July. His image was stamped onto coins. Temples were built in his honor, not as monuments to a god, but as anchors for memory. And yet, his true legacy remained outside of stone. It lived in legislation, in administrative reforms, in the cadence of power. Even his greatest critics could not unwind the systems he had designed, because they worked, because they were necessary. Caesar taught Rome and the world that transformation does not come from theory. It comes from rhythm, from walking the front lines with your men, from rewriting the calendar so that every citizen knows when to sow and when to reap, from restructuring debt, rewarding loyalty, and punishing betrayal, not out of cruelty, but clarity. He had no patience for stagnation, and that is why history remembers him not as a man who disrupted Rome, but as the man who revealed what it had already become. No empire that came after could ignore his blueprint. Even those who despised him borrowed from him. They took his roads and laws, his symbols and rituals. They used his name as a crown and his calendar as scripture. In every kingdom that claimed order, Caesar stood behind the curtain. Because order was what he understood best, not control for its own sake, but structure that allowed greatness to grow. He believed in systems that could outlast their creators. That was his true obsession. Legacy not carved in stone, but embedded in daily life. And that legacy moved from Rome to Byzantium, from empire to nation, from republics to revolutions. Wherever someone tried to centralize chaos, his name was whispered, not because he conquered, but because he organized. He built the bridge between chaos and civilization, not perfectly, not painlessly, but with purpose. And bridges once built rarely go unused. They become paths. And those paths become futures, and those futures often forget who laid the first stone, but never forget the name chiseled underneath it. The Senate chamber eventually echoed with other voices, new laws, new emperors, new wars, but the rhythm Caesar set never truly stopped. He had shifted the center of power from debate to direction, from theory to execution. And even those who claim to restore the Republic never restored its spirit, because the people had tasted something different: predictable leadership, clear decisions, stability. And once experienced, such things are hard to forget. He had not created perfection, but he had shown what it meant to move forward, even in the face of resistance. His enemies hoped his death would erase the momentum, but it only clarified it. The knife had not undone the architecture. It had only reminded everyone how deeply the foundation had already been laid. His image became marble, his ideas became routine, and his silence after death spoke louder than his speeches ever had. Because in that silence, a new order grew, not by decree, but by inertia. And inertia, once started, is the purest form of power, because it doesn't ask. It carries everything with it. There's a quiet truth at the center of Caesar's story. He did not outlast his enemies. He outbuilt them. They relied on old systems, fragile alliances, rituals that no longer held meaning. He built new ones, legal, military, social, that didn't need applause to function. They simply worked. And when someone builds something that works, it doesn't matter who disagrees. The machine keeps moving. Even centuries later, historians debate his morality. Was he a tyrant? A visionary? A traitor to the Republic? But history does not honor debate. It honors momentum. And Caesar moved more decisively, more consistently, more effectively than anyone of his time. He did not wait for the world to understand him. He acted, and then let the world catch up or fall behind. In this, he was not just a man of his era. He became the edge of an era. And when eras turn, they do not ask permission. They simply arrive, and everything before them becomes memory. In the quiet after revolution, people do not long for chaos. They long for rhythm. And Caesar, more than any law or speech, had given them that. He had made the machines of government move again. He had fed the cities, paid the soldiers, opened the roads. He had reminded Rome what function felt like. His enemies gave speeches. He gave schedules. His rivals debated process. He delivered outcomes. And when a state, weary and wide, powerful but confused, finds someone who delivers clarity, it rarely asks whether he should. It simply lets him. That was Caesar's secret. He didn't conquer Rome. He made Rome coherent. And coherence, once delivered, is a difficult thing to replace. Because what he offered wasn't just control, it was relief. Relief from uncertainty, relief from drift, relief from a world that had forgotten how to move forward. So when the knife came, it didn't end a reign. It ended a rhythm, and the silence afterward was not peace. It was the absence of motion. And in that silence, Rome had to choose between memory and momentum, between tradition and transformation. And though the Senate wrapped itself in the language of the old days, the people felt the difference. The grain arrived on time. The roads were safe. The taxes were collected with consistency, not corruption. That was Caesar's legacy, not ideology, infrastructure, not charisma. cadence. He had governed like a builder, brick by brick, decision by decision, until the scaffolding around chaos collapsed. And even those who hated him built their arguments atop his foundations. Because when a structure stands, even its enemies use its shelter. He had not promised eternity. He had promised function. And function, in a world unraveling, was sacred. That's why his name survived. Not just as myth, but as method. The Caesarean way was not born in violence. It was born in structure. And structure, real structure, does not beg to be remembered. It simply lasts. You cannot assassinate a blueprint. You cannot stab a schedule. What Caesar left behind was more than memory. It was infrastructure encoded in governance, ritual replaced with rhythm, power redefined not by lineage, but by efficiency. His vision was not about a man elevated above the masses. It was about a system that worked, whether adored or feared. He showed that the strongest argument was not made with words or swords. It was made with competence, and competence is difficult to kill. That is why emperors came after him. That is why the Republic never returned. Because Caesar did not erase it with a war. He replaced it with a workflow. He made the Republic look outdated. He made dysfunction visible. And when people see what can be functional, they do not forget. They may grieve the loss of freedom, but they do not crave the return of failure. This is why his name became not only legend, but standard. The measure by which others would rise or fall. And so we return to the man. Not the myth, not the martyr, but the architect of movement. In the end, Caesar did not build for applause. He built because he could not bear to watch things fall apart. He carried Rome on his shoulders, not to elevate himself, but to steady a system already cracking beneath its own contradictions. That is what history forgets. That he did not move against the Republic out of hunger. He moved because no one else would. And when he stepped forward, the machine turned on again. Grain reached the cities, bridges were repaired, maps were redrawn, legions marched not in confusion, but in formation. That is what Caesar left behind, a world that moved. And that motion, quiet, relentless, orderly, became his signature. Even after the blade, even after the marble, even after the Senate echoed with new names, the rhythm remained. And in that rhythm, he still walks. You can walk the streets of modern cities and still feel his shape. In calendars that count from his rule. In governments that organize as he once did. In titles that echo his name, centuries and continents away. Caesar did not live to see his empire fully bloom, but he planted every root, and roots, once deep enough, do not ask for sunlight. They find it. He did not ask to be eternal, but he built like someone who knew time would test every inch of what he left behind. He knew that stone could fall, but systems adapt, and if built with discipline, they carry on. The Senate hoped to kill the man. They forgot he was also the map. The shape of Rome after Caesar was not an accident. It was a blueprint filled in. And though others ruled, fought, and fell, the shape remained. because Caesar had done more than command. He had configured. And configuration, once proven, becomes default. The default that changed the world. Not every legacy echoes with volume. Some move like gravity, silent, steady, inescapable. Caesar's presence is no longer a statue to visit. It is the cadence of command, the logic of leadership, the architecture of empire. He taught the world that reform is not rebellion, it is responsibility. That waiting is not wisdom, it is surrender. That when a system cracks, someone must pick up the pieces. And when no one else would, he did. He picked up Rome, held it together with discipline, redrew its map, rewired its motion, and though he fell beneath blades wielded by fear, the lines he carved into history did not bleed. They held, and because they held, the world shifted. So we close this chapter not with mourning, but with momentum. Not with a crown, but with a current. A quiet, pulsing current beneath every law, every road, every page where his name still lingers. Not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. And that never dies. He is no longer just a man in history. He is a frequency, a pattern, a way things move when the world refuses to hold. Call him conqueror, call him tyrant, call him reformer. But always remember he was the one who showed up when others folded, who wrote not just laws, but rhythm. And rhythm, once it takes root, outlives even memory. So let the statues wear down. Let the inscriptions fade. The real legacy is already absorbed in the architecture of ambition, in the discipline of leadership, in the quiet courage it takes to walk alone toward what must be done. That is Caesar, not the crown, not the knife, but the silence after, where the world still moves his way, and so he remains, not in monuments, but in motion, the motion of systems that work, the motion of power that flows with structure, the motion of history bending around one man's rhythm. Julius Caesar, no longer simply remembered, still moving. Julius Caesar had long since vanished into marble by the time the full weight of his legacy began to crystallize. But legacy does not wait for permission to form. It begins in the quiet moments, when reforms persist, when names are echoed in governance, when systems refuse to collapse because their foundations were built with obsessive care. This was the legacy of Caesar, not a crown, not even empire, but integration. Rome was no longer merely a republic, nor fully an autocracy. It was something new, something transitional, and at the heart of that transition stood the imprint of one man's logic. It was not his speeches that endured. It was the rhythm of his governance, taxation systems, military organization, urban planning, provincial standardization. Where once Rome had flexed through brute conquest, now it expanded with coordination, roads, bridges, laws, calendars, a matrix of function over glory, of structure over impulse. Even those who swore to defend the old republic found themselves using Caesar's playbook. Because it worked. Because once something coherent enters a chaotic system, it does not politely withdraw. it expands, and that expansion became the quiet empire Caesar never ruled, but unmistakably designed. You could walk through the Forum in the decades after Caesar's death and feel his absence in name, but his presence in everything else. The debates still echoed, but they no longer decided. The senators still gathered, but their words no longer shaped the machine. They rode it, because the machine had already been built. Augustus, shrewder than most, never claimed to be a king. He claimed to restore the Republic. But every gesture, from his tribunician powers to his control over the legions, moved within the framework Caesar left behind. A framework of flow, a government that governed, a calendar that told farmers when to plant, a census that told governors whom they ruled, a legal network that stretched beyond the 7 hills and into the dust of distant provinces. This was not legacy as lineage, it was legacy as infrastructure, the kind that doesn't fade with slogans or statues, the kind that remains because it is simply too effective to abandon. So even as marble faces changed and oaths were sworn in new names, the world beneath those oaths still moved the way Caesar had arranged. Because he had not built identity, he had built rhythm, and rhythm, once felt, does not need to be remembered. It simply continues. The true reach of Caesar's legacy was not in Rome alone. It extended along the roads his engineers paved, across provinces once fractured by culture, now united by law, through the voices of administrators trained in Latin, delivering judgments by imperial statute, and through coins, small, ordinary coins, stamped with his profile, passed hand to hand by people who never saw Rome, but who lived under rules Caesar once imagined. This was how he endured, not in conquest, but in coherence. The eastern provinces did not rebel because they could trade. The western frontiers did not fracture because they could govern. Even as emperors came and went, some wise, some cruel, the operating system remained. The structures were too integrated, the blueprint too clear. You could replace the man at the top, but you couldn't replace the spine that held it all up. Caesar was no longer a figure. He was a foundation, and foundations don't rule. They support, silently, relentlessly, until one day, no one remembers where the stones end and the structure begins. And that's how you know a legacy has integrated. It disappears by becoming everything. Even centuries later, long after the fall of Rome, long after emperors were toppled and barbarian kings sat on stolen thrones, Caesar's system whispered beneath the rubble. Medieval scholars read his commentaries like scripture. Islamic mathematicians used his calendar to align celestial charts. Church clerics borrowed his administrative division of provinces when crafting dioceses. Because function, when built with care, transcends collapse. It waits, and when the world resets, it returns. The Renaissance did not rediscover Caesar. It remembered him, not as a conqueror, but as a calibrator. The Enlightenment too invoked his methods. Lawmakers, revolutionaries, and philosophers looked to his precision, his reforms, his raw will to organize what others feared was ungovernable. And then modern states emerged. They built parliaments, wrote constitutions, filed censuses, stamped bureaucracies onto cities like Caesar, once stamped aqueducts across provinces. And though they gave themselves new names, they followed an old rhythm, the rhythm of infrastructure, of coherence, of Caesar. The empire he ruled with muscle is gone, but the one he built with method still stands, invisible, but undeniable. You won't find his face in every classroom, but you'll find his fingerprints in every syllabus that teaches how empires rise. You won't hear his voice in every debate, but you'll hear his cadence in every system that prizes function over flattery. Because what Caesar gave the world wasn't just rule, it was a rhythm of rule. He normalized motion, governance that moved, decisions that landed, systems that synchronized. And though his name has been warped, used by tyrants and romanticized by rebels, the essence remains. When things break, someone must rebuild. Not just in theory, but in diagrams, in tax codes, in grain flows and border patrols and civic contracts. Caesar did not just understand power, he understood planning. And in a world often distracted by spectacle, his genius was not in spectacle at all. It was in structure, it was in the quiet, the paperwork behind the parades, the grain ships behind the declarations, the engineers behind the legions. And it is there, in the quiet, that legacy roots itself, not where the crowd points, but where the future builds. The tragedy of Caesar's death was not just that he fell, it was that he fell misunderstood. He was not trying to be a god. He was trying to be a gear, one that made the rest of the machinery turn smoother, faster, cleaner. The Senate feared his ambition, but misunderstood its shape. It was not upward, toward divinity. It was outward, toward functionality. He sought not worship, but refinement. And that kind of ambition, the kind that threatens to replace not just people, but processes, is the most dangerous kind of all, because it reveals what no longer works. And when people see what's broken, they stop romanticizing it. Caesar made Rome stop romanticizing itself. He forced it to choose between nostalgia and necessity, and in that choice, he became both villain and savior, both destroyer and deliverer. Because transformation, by nature, offends the comfortable, and Caesar did not serve comfort. He served coherence. Not for a throne, for a future. And that is why, long after the blood dried, the system kept breathing. Not out of reverence, out of reliability. It's easy to remember the man who marched with legions, harder to remember the one who reformed the calendar. But both were Caesar, and it was the calendar that lasted longer. That is the paradox of legacy. The loudest acts fade fastest. The quiet ones become foundations. In reforming the Roman calendar, Caesar synchronized agriculture, religion, taxation, and trade. He replaced confusion with clarity, a clarity so effective that we still live inside it. Every January, every leap year, every date that tells us where we are in time. That is Caesar, ticking beneath the modern world, not shouting, just present. And this is what integration looks like. Not memory, but motion. A pulse that doesn't demand attention because it works too well to notice. His true genius was not the conquest of territory. It was the conquest of disarray, the unification of voices, regions, currencies, schedules. He didn't just organize Rome, he taught the West what order could feel like. And once you feel that kind of order, you do not crave its author. You crave its return, and that craving, that deep subconscious hunger for coherence, is Caesar's true monument. The shape of the modern state owes more to Caesar than to kings, because he understood the difference between dominion and design. Kings ruled over people. Caesar ruled through systems. He knew that a true legacy does not lie in how many banners fly your crest. It lies in whether those banners fall in rhythm with something greater. His genius wasn't in centralization alone. It was in standardization. He didn't just collect power. He calibrated it, balanced it, distributed it so that the machine ran even in his absence. It is easy to imagine empire as a sword, but Caesar made it a spreadsheet. That is not poetry, that is permanence. Because forms outlast flags, and function outlasts fame. So when later rulers wanted to stabilize, they did not emulate gods. They emulated Caesar, not because he was beloved, because he was effective. He turned intention into institution, turned habit into hardware, and in doing so, turned a fragile republic into the blueprint for bureaucratic civilization. That was the real empire, not Rome, but rhythm. Even in death, Caesar gave Rome something it had never truly had: continuity. Not the illusion of it, not the ceremony of it, but real operational continuity. Augustus may have inherited the throne, but he inherited something else more valuable: a workflow. He didn't need to invent order, he simply stepped into it. Caesar had already wired the city. Grain moved where it needed to go. Troops were posted according to need, not favoritism. Provincial governors reported not to parties, but to purpose. And the Senate, once the theatre of endless obstruction, became procedural, bureaucratic, not because Augustus demanded it, because Caesar had designed it. Integration means you do not need to fight for order. You follow it, and this is why Caesar's death failed to dismantle what he built. Because what he built was not belief. It was rhythm, and rhythm cannot be assassinated. It only waits, then continues. You can see his influence not just in capitals, but in the spaces between them. In the roads, the posts, the rule books and border stones and contracts written in ink that lasts because the structure that holds them does. That's the irony. Caesar died young for a system designed to live long. And it has. Not always in name, but always in nature. When France codified its civil law, when Britain normalized colonial bureaucracy, when the United States balanced branches of government with checks and ledgers, that's Caesar, not the man, the method. He is in the margins of maps, in the intervals of census cycles, in the cadence of command that favors function over flair. This is integration, when the author no longer needs to be named, because the system he set in motion speaks for him. And that voice, structured, consistent, quietly directive, is still echoing, still building, still shaping what comes next. He never claimed to be timeless, but he built like someone who knew time was watching. Caesar did not chase eternity through temples or myth. He chased it through structure. He refined grain logistics. He reorganized debt. He restructured command lines in the legions so that power flowed clean, downward and outward, but never chaotically. He turned ambition into spreadsheets before spreadsheets existed. He knew that the gods change, but payrolls must balance, that festivals fade, but water must arrive. He trusted process over applause. And this is why his legacy didn't need revival. It only needed maintenance. What survives is what's functional. And Caesar was function, personified. He was the hum behind the empire's heartbeat, the pulse beneath the politics. And even now, when someone speaks of reform, of efficiency, of building something that can outlast the builder, they speak, knowingly or not, of Caesar, not as a symbol, but as a signal that systems, not statues, are how the past persists. You won't find his doctrine carved into stone. There is no Caesarism in textbooks the way there is Marxism or Platonism, because his doctrine was not philosophy, it was logistics. His sermon was not delivered in verses. It arrived with bread, with order, with systems that worked so seamlessly they slipped beneath the skin of the state and stayed there. Even when Rome cracked under its own expansion, those systems migrated east to Byzantium, west to France, through scribes, kings, monks, merchants. They became the tools of modernity, and while Caesar's name echoes in grand stories of power, it's in the ordinary that his design endures. Postal service, tax records, public roads, scheduled festivals, legal zones, urban grids, bureaucratic ranks. He made function divine, and in doing so, he made divinity obsolete. The future no longer needed prophecy, it needed process. And Caesar, long dead, long buried, still whispers in the way a system aligns. Not because he demanded worship, but because he engineered reliability. And reliability, once embedded, writes its own gospel. There's a kind of power that doesn't come from crowns or campaigns. It comes from utility, from creating something so efficient, so scalable, that it becomes invisible. That was Caesar. He did not embed himself in myth. He embedded himself in routine, in how a city collects trash, in how a census is counted, in how a province reports surplus. The brilliance wasn't that he ruled. It was that after he stopped ruling, the structure didn't stop. It folded his rhythm into the bones of administration. And when something enters the bone, it doesn't feel foreign. It feels natural. That is the highest form of integration. Not obedience, absorption. So when modern leaders speak of efficiency, when municipalities digitize their records, when city planning echoes a central grid, they don't need to name Caesar. He's already there, in the logic, in the pulse, not as a ghost, as a generator. And a generator, once wired in, does not need applause. It just keeps everything else running. To understand the full integration of Caesar's legacy, you have to look beyond the statues. Look at cities, at borders, at bureaucracies, at school timetables and tax deadlines, at postal delivery schedules and government departments with names that trace back, indirectly, to his reforms. That is the secret of real influence. It does not stay in the headlines. It settles in the margins. And in those margins, it matures. Caesar's genius was not to make Rome worship him. It was to make Rome operate without him. He taught a civilization how to automate itself before automation had a name. When others pursued personal glory, he pursued systemic clarity. That is why so much of the modern world carries echoes of his design, not as monument, but as method. Legacy isn't what's remembered, it's what remains. And what remains of Caesar is not nostalgia, it is infrastructure, it is schedule, it is motion without disruption. And this is how a man becomes more than remembered. He becomes embedded, unseen, but everywhere. There is a silence to systems that work. They don't shout, they hum. And Caesar, more than most, understood that silence was the sound of sustainability. He didn't chase immortality through lineage. He chased it through logistics. He knew that the loudest emperors fade first, that the quiet disciplines, taxation, roads, water supply, population counts, are what hold civilization up when the banners fall. His legacy doesn't rise in moments of triumph. It rises in routine, in the schedule that stays, the harvest that arrives, the jurisdiction that knows where it ends. Rome collapsed more than once, but the rhythm he established never truly did. It moved through time like a current. It bent toward adaptation. When the church needed hierarchy, it borrowed from Caesar. When kingdoms needed records, they used his frame. When democracies needed order, they reused his scaffolding, not to honor him, but because it worked. That's how you know a builder built well. When his blueprints are used by people who don't even know his name, but live by his logic. In every empire since Rome there is a shadow. It is not in the military. It is not in the palace. It is in the process. That shadow is Caesar. When a ruler reorganizes administration, standardizes law, reforms finance, they invoke him, whether they mean to or not. Because he did it first, he made empire feel efficient, not just grand. He made authority feel rational, not just loud. And while his name was carved into stone, his method was carved into motion. It was Caesar who reminded the world that true power isn't just in commanding others. It's in organizing them, in aligning them, in making the machine move forward even when no one is watching. That's why the most powerful legacy isn't worship. It's repetition. And Caesar, long buried, long debated, is still repeated, not in myth, but in every system that runs on logic. He does not need to return. He never left. He became the architecture, and architecture, once inhabited, becomes home. Caesar's true monument isn't made of marble. It's made of moments. Small, repeatable patterns embedded in statecraft. A census recorded, a policy enacted, city zoned with symmetry and foresight. He knew legacy wasn't a statue. It was a schedule. And while poets wrote verses and rivals plotted knives, Caesar wrote workflow. And workflow, once felt, is hard to forget. That's why historians revisit his reign, not just for the battles, but for the reforms. Not for the glory, but for the grid. He is remembered not because he ruled, but because he regulated. He found the parts that didn't move and made them move again, and in doing so, became the silent engine inside centuries of political function. He did not invent civilization. He optimized it. And when the world breaks, when chaos returns, it often seeks what he left behind. Not heroism, but harmony. Not memory, but machinery. Because what Caesar designed was not only empire, it was the operating system beneath it. He made the abstract real. That was his greatest act, not commanding loyalty, but designing systems that didn't need it to function. Because Caesar understood that empires rise on dreams, but they survive on documentation, on maps that match the terrain, on taxes that arrive on time, on leaders who know where their authority begins and where it ends. He reduced guesswork. He replaced ambiguity with alignment, and alignment, once felt, becomes addictive. That's why people feared him, not for his ambition, but for his accuracy. He saw too clearly what Rome had become and what it needed to continue. He did not bring an end. He built an interface between past and future, between glory and government. And interfaces don't require legacy to be loved, only to be used. Caesar's legacy is not in how we feel about him. It's in how we function because of him. Quietly, efficiently, endlessly. That is not the echo of a dictator. It's the hum of design. When governments organize populations today, by region, by class, by productivity, they use language Caesar would have understood. When cities allocate resources based on zoning and census, that's Caesar. When supply chains stretch across territories under a common legal framework, that's Caesar. He would not recognize the machines, but he would recognize the rhythm, because he wrote it. He etched it into empire. He baked it into bureaucracy. He didn't just wield Rome. He recircuited it. So now, every time we fill out a tax form, follow a court docket, or vote in a district named long before our birth, we walk a trail he lit. Not out of nostalgia, out of necessity. Because once a system works, it rarely gets undone. It mutates, adapts, finds new faces. But the spine stays. And Caesar built the spine, not for credit, but for coherence. That's why he lasts. Not because he was worshipped, but because he was wired in. Legacy doesn't always feel like reverence. Sometimes it feels like repetition. And repetition, when engineered well, becomes stability. That was Caesar's gift. Not the spectacle of empire, but the cadence behind it. Not the roar, the routine. He didn't build monuments. He built schedules, and schedules, once embedded, don't break easily. They endure in court calendars and election cycles, in agricultural timetables and fiscal years, in the pulse of predictability that makes civilization feel navigable. We do not see his name on every wall, but we feel his imprint in every process that doesn't need to be questioned. That's how you know a system is working. You don't notice it, you just follow it. Caesar didn't invent power. He refined it. He made it flow more efficiently, more humanly, more clearly. And in doing so, he left behind not just a model of command, but a method of motion. Motion that still moves us, whether we know it or not. The world forgot his voice, but it kept his cadence. Caesar's real conquest wasn't Gaul, it was inertia. He shifted the gravitational center of power, not by seizing it, but by structuring it, so that power no longer needed charisma to flow. It needed protocol. He taught states how to think in systems, and systems, once established, do not ask for legacy. They become it. You see him in parliamentary procedure, in tax code revisions, in the layout of a grid city built to withstand scale. He is there in the decision trees, in the flow charts, in the administrative policies reviewed not for honor, but for clarity. He taught the world that the opposite of collapse isn't empire, it's rhythm. And rhythm, once installed, can outlive its founder. That's why Caesar doesn't need to be revived. He is not waiting to return. He is already in the return itself, in the ritual, in the regulation, in the reasons we call order by that name. Because once a system holds, it no longer needs the builder. It becomes the building. He's not quoted in constitutions, but he's there, in how they're enforced. He's not prayed to in temples, but he's there, in how cities are planned, and courts are funded, and roads are repaired on schedules written by committees. Because that's what Caesar knew: gods inspire loyalty, but systems inspire consistency. And consistency is what civilizations need most when ambition fades and memory dulls. He didn't promise forever. He designed for function. And that's why he remains. His name does not rise from pulpits. It rises from practices, from how meetings are run, from how logistics are scaled, from how leadership aligns with administration, not to seize glory, but to reduce friction. That's Caesar, not on the coin, in the circulation of the coin, not in the law, in the enforcement of it. His legacy is not what we remember, it's what we rely on, quietly, completely, continuously. Even when Rome fell, when invaders burned libraries and toppled columns, something in its rhythm stayed intact. Not its temples, its timing, not its gods, its governance, the idea that structure could survive personality, that process could replace politics. That is Caesar's deepest imprint. He didn't ask to be worshipped. He didn't demand to be adored. He simply made it difficult to imagine a state functioning any other way. And that is the quiet power of systems. They don't argue, they endure. And when a new civilization rises from the ashes, it does not start from scratch. It reaches back, not for a myth, but for a model. And the model most often waiting is his. not because he was perfect, but because he was precise. And precision, once proven, survives ruin. It lives not in memory, but in motion. And Caesar, long gone, long buried, is still moving the world forward. One form, one function, one perfectly timed rotation at a time. This is how legacy hides, not in gold, but in gears, not in verses, but in verifiable results. When Caesar reformed the calendar, he wasn't crafting poetry. He was building reliability. When he restructured municipal debt, he wasn't earning praise. He was reducing friction. That is the mark of real influence. Not when people quote you, but when they can't operate without you. And today, entire governments, cities, and networks run in cadence with what he put into motion. They don't call it Caesar's model. They call it infrastructure. They call it governance. They call it basic. Because that's what happens when something truly integrates. It stops feeling revolutionary. It starts feeling necessary. And that's why Caesar's greatest triumph wasn't war. It was normalization. Making order feel inevitable. Making coherence feel native. And making the future easier to build because the tools were already waiting. Not in temples, in templates. Left behind by a man who didn't just lead Rome. He installed its firmware. The mark of a true builder is not how loudly they are remembered. It's how quietly they are used. And Caesar, once the most polarizing man in Rome, has become the most unacknowledged architect of governance. Not because he was erased, but because he became assumed, embedded, expected. You don't thank the clock for keeping time. You just live by it. That's Caesar now. Not an idol, an instrument of movement, of repetition, of form refined until it could be forgotten. Not because it failed, but because it fused. He no longer needs to be discussed. He needs only to be deployed. In how leaders think through scale, in how systems seek stability, in how the future prefers function over fame. Because that's what he gave us. Not a myth to revisit, but a method to reuse. And the fact that we still reuse it, without fanfare, without question, means he didn't just conquer Gaul. He conquered chaos, with process. He did not write manifestos. He wrote minutes. He did not sculpt identity. He scheduled it. And that scheduling, so exact, so effective, became its own kind of mythology. Not in epics, but in efficacy. What Caesar offered was not inspiration. It was installation of repeatable logic, of process over spectacle, of policies that did not need his hand to keep moving. He didn't want the world to remember him. He wanted it to run better. So he rethreaded the fabric of leadership, not around charisma, but around clarity. And that clarity, once installed, became durable. That is why centuries forgot his personality, but kept his pattern. They buried the man and inherited the method. That is the truest form of integration. Not permanence through power, but permanence through precision. So now, as nations operate and organize in the silence of functioning code, They do so with echoes of Caesar, not as ruler, but as root. It's easy to forget that Caesar did not seek to immortalize himself. He sought to organize the world, and that organization, stable, silent, enduring, became his immortality. He proved that the real conquest is not land, it's latency, getting a system to work so well that it needs no name to continue. He wrote in code disguised as governance, and that code still compiles. It powers institutions, bureaucracies, and civil services from Rome to every republic that followed, not as doctrine, but as design. Because design that serves people, that scales, that simplifies, that sustains, becomes part of them. They live by it, they trust it, they build on it, and never ask who laid the first blueprint. That's Caesar's victory. Not in the past, in the pattern. So when systems feel familiar, when structures feel obvious, when process feels eternal, it is not because they are natural, it is because they are inherited. From a man who designed not to be worshipped, but to be useful, forever, and maybe that's the point of legacy. Not to be seen, but to be felt, to vanish into the scaffolding of progress, to disappear into the daily flow of functioning systems, because the most complete integration is the one no longer noticed. It just works. And when you feel that, the quiet click of things aligning, the absence of confusion, the presence of structure that doesn't call attention to itself, you are not in the shadow of a hero. You are in the hum of a builder. And Caesar, buried beneath centuries, argued by scholars, mythologized and criticized, is still humming beneath us. Beneath the laws, the plans, the roads, the clocks, not as echo, but as engine, driving not toward memory, but toward continuity, not toward honor, but toward motion. And if you've ever relied on a system and didn't even know who made it, that's how you know the builder succeeded. That's how you know Caesar is still here. Because in the end, Julius Caesar did not just change Rome. He changed what it meant to lead, not through charisma, but through clarity, not by demanding loyalty, but by designing systems that earned it. He showed that real power is not about presence, it's about persistence. That the truest mark of influence is not in how long people remember your name, but how long they move through your design, unaware, unhindered, unbroken. So when we close this chapter, we do not bow, we do not mourn. We simply recognize that something deeper than memory is at work. Structure, schedule, system, all still running, slowly, silently, beneath the modern world. And at the center of that hum, not a myth, not a man, but a method named Caesar, still turning the wheel, still threading the rhythm, still shaping the shape of things to come.